Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time it is where you are. My name is Bill Geswich, and I'm coming to you from the beautiful city of Savannah, Georgia. Today I'd like to take you through a process that I like to follow whenever I learn a new technology, and that's to understand it from scratch. So today we're going to take you through a console application all the way to a server-side Blazor application. It should only take about 20 minutes, so let's get started. A couple of things that you'll need in order to follow along with the video today, and that's Visual Studio 2019 and .NET Core SDK 3.1. If you don't have it on a machine or you need help getting that installed, check out a video that I have on my site that takes you through that process and verifies that you have the right SDK installed. A couple of other things that you'll need in order to follow along with the video: just some type of working knowledge of C#, some knowledge of web applications and how they might be hosted, especially in .NET Core, and then some minor HTML experience. As far as taking you through the video today, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a console application. We'll do that by using the Visual Studio 2019 template. And then we will transition that application into a Razor application. Since Blazor is built on Razor, that is the first step that we want to go through. And then once we do that, we will go and implement the Blazor components, which are actually called Razor components, in a Blazor application. It'll be a pretty basic application today, but I did want to show you the steps and how we go from a console application to a Blazor application. So let's go to Visual Studio and get started. Okay, here we are in Visual Studio 2019. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We want it to be a console application, so we can type in console. For me, it pops up as the first anyway. We want it to be a console app, .NET Core, and make sure it's C#. So we'll click there, click on Next, and we'll call this Blazor App from Scratch. Pretty simple name. Click on Create. And the console application gets created. Let's go ahead and run this just to make sure. You see the console, you see Hello World, a little bit of debugging information, and press any key to close. So we'll go ahead and press the key, and you see that's it. That's the console application right now. All it does is write Hello World to the console. A couple other things about this solution. We have the program CS file here, and then we have some dependencies. And the only dependency we have right now is Microsoft.NET Core.app. So now there are 3 steps that we're going to need in order to transition this console application to a Razor application. The first is going to be to make some changes to this project file, and we'll do that in a second. The second that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to update the program CS file, and then we're going to have to add a new class called Startup that does some configuration. That's the second step. And then the third step is we need to add a Razor page so that when the website launches, we actually display something in the browser. So those are the 3 steps we're going to take you through. Okay, so here we are back in Visual Studio 2019 and in the Blazor App from Scratch solution. As we mentioned just a minute ago, the first step is to update the project file. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and double click on the project file. Sometimes you can make changes in the project file by right-clicking on it and clicking on Properties, but unfortunately what we need to change can only be done through the file, at least right now. So here in the first line it mentions the SDK that's being used, Microsoft.NET.SDK. The only thing we need to add there is .web. That tells the system that we are going to be building a web application. And what I like to do is I like to get rid of this output type XE just because we don't need it, and I don't like to have anything in my project file that I don't need. So go ahead and do that. And when we click Save, we'll look over here at the Solution Explorer, and you'll see that a few things change. The one that we were concerned about is under Dependencies and under Frameworks, that Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.app now shows up. That's perfect because that contains the code and the references that we need in order to build the console application. So that's the first step. We went ahead and we updated the project file, just added the .web, got rid of the .exe, and we saved it. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. The next step, as I mentioned previously, was to modify the program CS file, and that's what we're going to do now. In order to do this, the first thing we need to do is, and the way I like to do, I like to keep my main method pretty small, and I also like to follow the way that Microsoft does it in their templates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify main in a second, but I'm going to add another method below it, and it's going to be a public method. It's also going to be a static method. It's going to return an iHost builder, and that's the type that we need in order to start creating a web host. And I will call this create host builder. Now before we go too far, let's get rid of at least this red squiggly. We're going to use our favorite friend, Control period. That pops up a list of suggestions. We want that first one to use the Microsoft.extensions.hosting. So we'll go ahead and apply that. This method will take the same parameters that the main method does. You'll see how we use that in a second. And it's a pretty short method, so we're going to use a lambda expression in order to put that together. So first is to call host.createDefaultBuilder. That helps. That's the first step in the process. And we'll send it the args. Now this is really where the website, this next step is really where the website gets built. .configure, and if I spell it correctly, it's going to give me a nice tooltip here, Microsoft Web Host Defaults. And that's what we need. We'll use another lambda expression. We'll call it Web Builder. And again, I'm using a lot of the Microsoft standards just so that when you see applications created from templates in the future, it'll make sense to you. So we go ahead and do that. And for now, the only option we're going to set up is webbuilder.useStartup. And we'll give it a type of startup. And that's it. Let's put that there. Now you notice we have a red squiggly under use startup. So we'll use our favorite friend again, Control period. It tells us we need another using called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.hosting. We accept that. And now the only reference that's given us a red squiggly is startup because we don't have a class called startup. We'll do that in a second. Let's go back to the main method, and since we don't need that console write line anymore, let's delete that, and then let's call the create host builder args, and then we want to build it and we want to run it. Now what's going on here? Well, unlike a console application, a web application needs to sit and stay awake and alive to respond to HTTP requests. So unlike a console application that executes and then ends, this creates a host, builds it, and then runs it. And it sits waiting for HTTP requests in order to respond to them. So that's what this is doing. Here it's saying, okay, we've got some more configuration to do, and we'll do that in a class called startup. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's go over to the project file. We'll right click. Let's click on add. We'll add a new item. The new item we'll add is a class, and we're going to call this class startup. It is a public class, and there are two methods that the host builder function is looking for. The first one is public void configure services. And the next one is, and let me just do that. The next one is public void configure. So those are the two standards. Sometimes you'll see some additional ones, and we'll talk about those in future videos. But right now, these are the two methods that need to be in the startup class in order for a website to get configured properly and run accordingly. So let's talk about configure for services first. In here, we configure any services that the web host will need. So in this case, we're going to define a parameter called iService collection and services. Now notice we have a red squiggly. We'll use our favorite friend, control period, and that adds the extension for dependency injection. Dependency injection is a very important subject that you'll learn throughout using .NET Core applications. If you're interested in me doing a separate session on dependency injection, please comment in the comments below, and I'll be happy to do a separate section on it, but it is a little beyond the scope of this video today. The only service that we're going to rely on for what we're doing right now is services.add Blazor pages. That's it. There are separate options you can set, but today we're just going to take all the standard defaults. Now let's go to configure. Configure, we're going to accept one parameter, which is an application builder. And then we'll call that app. Notice there's a red squiggly. We control and we accept the using Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Builder. So a couple of things. So what this basically does is start configuring the website. We've added the service Blazor pages. Now we had to add a couple of other things. So now the only parameter we're going to accept is the app parameter for the application builder. Once again, this is a very basic web server. So there's only a couple of things that we're going to configure in here. First one is app.use routing. That basically tells the web host that we are going to use routing within this, adds a Microsoft routing endpoint middleware to the specified app. So we're basically adding the routing middleware to the app. That allows you to handle any routing requests that come up. The other one that we're going to add right now is app.use endpoints. So this defines the endpoints that we're going to use as part of our routing. And that'll be a Lambda expression. And we will define endpoints.map Blazor pages. We'll put a semicolon there and a semicolon there. That's all we're going to do to configure our very basic Blazor web host right now. There are a lot of other options which we'll talk about in future videos, but for today, that's all we're going to need. So that's step 2. We've added the program class, and let's just go back there for a second. We've made the modifications. Notice that the startup reference is now reconciled. We've added the startup class, and the third step is to create a HTML page that displays when the host starts. Okay, since we accepted all the defaults for add Blazor pages, we're going to use the defaults. When a Blazor application starts, it looks for the HTML pages it needs in a folder called pages. So let's add that now. We'll right-click on the project, we'll click on add, we'll click on new folder, and we'll call it pages. Again, that's a very specific name that Blazor is looking for, and then all of the HTML pages will exist below that. What we're going to do is we're going to right-click, we'll add, and we're going to add a new item into that folder, and we're going to add a Blazor page, and we'll call that index CS.html for a C# HTML file. I'm going to click on Add, and it'll add the index.html file into the Pages folder. Now, first directive, very important. This is what's used for all the routing. I like to always add, even though it's the index and it's a default, I always like to say, yep, it's the root default. So we go ahead and add that. Then I don't need right now any index model, and I also am not going to put any code in here. Or that's for C# code, so I'm just going to delete those. But I am going to add one thing, which is a h1 HTML tag, and I will say hello world. And that's it. Let's go ahead and run this. And if everything comes together nicely, we will see the web browser will launch, and there we are in hello world. So there you have it. We now have a console application that we've transitioned to be a Blazor application. Let's close the browser, and we're back to Visual Studio. Let's talk about the steps to transition from a Blazor app to a Blazor app. The first step is to update the startup class. We'll need to add the server-side Blazor service, add the ability to use static pages, and update the endpoints. After that, we'll add an _imports Blazor file to the main project that'll contain all the references needed for Blazor. The third thing we'll do is add the main app Blazor component, which is really used for routing within Blazor applications. Fourth, we'll create the _host CS HTML file and reference the app component there. That'll be the transition from Blazor to Blazor. And finally, we'll add an index.Blazor page to the Pages folder that'll contain our first Blazor, or really Blazor, component. Now, back in Visual Studio, let's make the changes to the startup class. Let's make sure we have the startup class in the editor, and there'll be a few changes we need to make here as we just previously discussed. The first one is to add the ability to use server-side Blazor. We do that by adding a service called services.add server-side Blazor. That's it for configure services. Now, let's go down to the configure, and there are a couple of things we need to do here. The first is the ability to be able to deliver some static files from the server to the browser. There's a JavaScript file, and there'll be CSS files in the future. So we want to add the ability to use static files. You do that by specifying app.use static files. And then, because we're using Blazor now instead of Blazor, there's a couple of additional things we have to do here on the endpoint side. Instead of using map Blazor pages, we'd use map Blazor hub. And that uses SignalR to communicate the DOM changes between the server and the client. So that's the first thing we need to do. The other piece we need to do is to endpoints.map fallback to page, and we want to do a /_host. And that's the file we just previously discussed. Whenever the browser goes to home, it'll default to this page, and this is what kicks off the Blazor process, as you'll see in a few minutes. The next thing we want to do is insert the _imports Blazor file. So we'll go up to the project, right click, click on add, and click on a new item. And here you want to be really careful. There's a couple of things called Blazor view, Blazor page. If you notice when I click on those, the extension of the file is CS.html. We don't want that. We want an extension of Blazor, and the way you get that is through a Blazor component. The first file we want is something called _imports.Blazor. Be very careful with the name of that. That is a standard, it's a convention, and we want to use that. Now in here we won't need any of this code. And what we will need is a number of using statements. And rather than bore you with the details of me typing it in, I'll copy and paste it, and we can talk about that when that's done. Here are the common using statements that we have. These are pretty standard for any Blazor application, so you can go ahead and copy it. We do need one more for now. We'll actually add another one in a future video, but right now we need to add a using for the main app so it can find any files that are in the main folder. And that's it. The one thing that I do here is I make sure that I save the project, because these usings sometimes don't get picked up by Visual Studio until the file's saved. So I want to go ahead and do that now. The next file we want to add is we want to add the app.razor file. And we want to use the same process, add new item. Again, be careful, choose the Razor component so that we've got a Razor name. And likewise, on this folder, we're not going to need anything that's in here, so let's go ahead and delete that. And rather than you watch me type, I'm going to copy in the code for this file, and then we'll talk about it when I copy it in. Now that the code's copied in, let's talk about what it's doing. Blazor applications have their own set of routing, and this file is looking for that routing and setting up data that it displays depending on what it finds. Up here it says if it's found, if the route is found, and we'll show you how to find a route within Blazor in a minute. It's very similar to Razor. And if it's found, then what this code is saying is just go ahead and display the component that you found. And if it's not found, display this HTML, sorry, there's nothing at this address. That's all this is doing, but it's a very important piece of the Blazor story. And that's it. So let's go ahead and save that. The next thing we're going to do is create that _host file that we need and we referenced before. We're going to right click on the pages, click on add, click on new item. Now here, instead of a Razor component, we do want a CS/HTML file. So we'll click on Razor view just to keep it as simple as possible. And we will call this _host. That file has just these things included. We don't need any of it, so we get rid of that. The first thing we want to do is put a page directive. We want to make that the slash that we talked about before. We want to add the namespace, and we will call that Blazor app from scratch .pages. Then we want to add tag helpers, and we want to add the Microsoft .ASP.NET Core net core .mvc.tag helpers. And those are the headers that we need. And then we're going to add something that's going to look a little funny at first, but it's actually the core of Blazor. It's adding an app tag, and instead of accepting applet, we hit escape. So you have app and then the closed app tag. Hit enter, and then here's where the component gets pulled in. There's actually a component tag. The first parameter is a type, so it'll be type equals type of app. And if you notice, things are highlighting in the right colors, and that's because of the usings and the tag helper that we had up above. And the render mode, there is the other parameter, and there's 3 types, but right now we're just going to use server pre-rendered, and we will end that tag. And what that does, it's going to bring in this app.razor file that we created before, and that brings it into the host. Okay? Now, all Blazor applications rely on a JavaScript file that's included in the framework. So we do need to include that in this host file, and that's the way you do that is script, the source equals _framework / Blazor .server.js. We'll close that out, and there you have it. Now we'll save this file. Again, I like to save it along the way just in case. And the next thing we're going to add is an index.razor file that's going to contain the Razor component that will ultimately get displayed. And we'll explain that in a second. Now, because we are creating a index Razor, we actually don't need the index CSHTML file anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that, deleting that from the file. What we're going to do next, we go back to Pages, right click, click on Add, New Item. We're going to click on Razor Component, and let's call this index.razor. The name actually doesn't matter that much. I'm going to explain this in a second. And in the code, let's get rid of everything and let's do a couple of things. We're going to add a page directive again, and we're going to put the root directory. Now this is where Razor gets the critical paths it needs to route things. This will be the main root, so that's why I put the backslash here. Now any HTML will get pulled in whenever the root folder is looked for. So here we're going to say h3 hello from my first Blazor component. Let's save that. And let's go ahead and run it. And I'm going to explain what's going on here in a second. There you go. Now notice we're in the root. If I type in /test, notice it says, sorry, there's nothing at this address. If I get rid of the /test and we stay at the home, there it is, hello from my first Blazor component. And now we've successfully transitioned our original console application all the way to a Blazor application. Thanks for watching, and here's my contact information.